Hey guys, Lucas from iExplore here. Today we're going to talk about the optimal street photography settings for the Ricoh GR3 or the GR3X, which I also shoot with, but today I have a GR3. And I'm going to talk about, how to kind of customize the buttons or how I do it, the actual settings that I use for various situations, and some other details that make the camera experience or the shooting experience optimal for me on my GR3. Of course, check out our Patreon if you want to support this channel. In fact, the idea for this video was from somebody on Patreon, so it was a suggestion or a question like, hey, can you do this video? And I thought that's a great idea, let's do it. So if you get on there, we definitely listen to suggestions from there a little bit more readily than ones from YouTube comments, although we do listen to those as well. Also, this video is sponsored by portraitmode.io, which is a photo sharing app that I've been using for the past few months. They've sponsored our videos before. I quite like it. It's very simple, very minimal, very clean. And most importantly to me, it doesn't feel like mega corporatized like all the big social media sites. It still has this kind of local sort of mom and pop shop sort of feel, so to speak, that I like about it. I appreciate that very much. And also they do have a membership recently that they kind of opened up, and all the money from the membership gets reinvested back into building out the website and the app. So check that out, and maybe I'll see you guys on there. Anyway, let's get on to the video.
iExplore.
All right guys, so just before we begin, I want to say that I'm not going to go through every single setting in the camera because that's ridiculous. It'll take forever. That'll be a very long video. I'm just going to go to the stuff that is like fundamental to me operating this camera smoothly. And actually the first thing I need to talk about is a couple of the customized button settings, because you can change what some of the buttons and dials do on the back and the top of the camera. And that really matters because it allows me to access the tools that I use a little bit more quickly, and I'm kind of hiding away the things that I really don't use. So in the custom settings menu, there are a couple things I've changed that are crucial to me. There's a lot of stuff I'm going to skip, but yeah, the first one, if I'm going to go to the FN button setting, and this is very important. For the FN button, which is the little button on the back of the camera that just says FN, that's my snap focus. Specifically, it's set snap. So what this does is it turns snap focus on and off, just at a touch of a button. I prefer using this compared to the full press snap, which is always enabled, but I don't really try to use that. I usually turn it all the way on and just keep it on for the moment where I need it. Then the ISO button, which is the left side of the dial, that's where I set my snap focus distance. So I can choose the distance that I want in case I want to change it. All right. Then for the other buttons, like the drive button, the movie wireless button, nothing important there. For the movie wireless button, I did make that my manual focus over here on the side, but I almost never use this, so I just kind of set it there. And then everything else, I just left as default. For the shooting info display, I have a very particular setup here where I only use two of them, so it's kind of hard to explain what I mean by them, but you'll be able to see on the screen. There are four sort of screens, three actual screens and one that's just the screen off. I only use the second one, and then I only have the LCD display, the grid guide, and the electronic level turned on. Everything else is off. And then what that allows me to do is that the display button on the back of the camera here turns the screen off and turns the screen on, and that's all it does, which allows me to save a lot of battery. A lot of people to me complain about the battery life of the GR. I never have any issues. For me, 2 batteries easily last like a 6 to 8 hour shooting session. Even one can be stretched if I'm not shooting too much, and that is because I'm not always turning the camera on and off, but I am keeping the screen off because that's what's really using the juice. So I'm shooting, I'm not shooting. Screen off, screen on, and so on. Very, very useful little setting. Also, you might be able to see there's very little stuff on my screen because I've turned it all off because I don't want to see all that clutter. I want to see the composition. The only caveat is if you do it this way, you don't have the battery meter. You actually have to, the only way to see the battery meter is if you hit play, and then it'll appear there on the last photo you took. That's a small price to pay for having no clutter on the screen. All I see is my main settings, my shutter, aperture, ISO, and the what do you call that thing? The spirit level, which matters to me because sometimes I'm framing things up that way. And I almost forgot, one more very important thing in terms of the controls is I've changed what this adjustment mode dial does. So when you press it, of course you can use it to change aperture by pressing left and right, but if you click it, you have these 5 menus available to you, and I've changed what those are. I don't remember what the defaults are, but for me I have ISO, focus, metering, drive mode, and the timer, the delay. And those are the ones that I use most often, especially ISO and focus are the ones I'm most likely to use. The other 3 only occasionally. So yeah, very important because as we talk about the other settings coming up, this will come up a little bit. And I think the default is not, the ISO is not over there because Normally ISO is on the button here, but I changed that to be snap focus so it's in the menu on the adjustment dial. That's my preference. All right, so now that we've talked about kind of the button setup, which is, you want to do that once, you never do that again, I want to talk about actually how I set the camera to be ready to shoot, okay? The actual settings. Now, some of you have maybe seen this on like the Ricoh channel. We do that. We did a video about this, and we've done a video about this in the context of Nikon cameras, but specifically on this camera, I'm going to talk about first and foremost auto ISO with a max ISO setting and a minimum shutter speed. Very important. So I have to go to the main menu, and then in the shooting menu there is a section called ISO setting, and when I go in there, I'm going to put on auto. I set my upper limit, ISO upper limit, on 6400, which I think is totally fine on a GR3, but if you think that's too high of an ISO because there's too much noise, just do a lower one. But I'm okay with the performance of 6400. Then my lower limit is just the minimum ISO in the camera, which is 100 ISO. And then this is the most important thing, my minimum shutter speed is 1/250. Because when I care about the minimum shutter speed, it's usually because I'm shooting things that are moving, and I find that 250 is usually enough. It's not enough for like somebody running or a bicycle or something like fast, but just people walking or standing around or gesturing like I am, it will freeze the action at 250 and it's going to look great. Slower than that and you get motion blur, which I usually don't want. But we'll get to motion blur because sometimes I do want it. This is also why, going back to why I put ISO in this adjustment dial, because I didn't, I took it off of here because that's snap focus, and sometimes I want to use manual ISO in specific cases, so I like to have it available there for me, so hence the adjustment dial is important there. But generally, I keep the ISO on auto when doing street, and I'm using aperture mode. So that allows that minimum shutter speed to take into effect. So the camera, like right now, if I point it over there, it's choosing, 1/250, my minimum. I'm on f4, and it's doing 6400 ISO, so it's hitting my max. Now, in this situation, if I want to lower the ISO, I don't have to change, I don't have to go to the, to change the ISO setting like I was just saying. All I know is if I go from f4 to f2.8, the ISO will drop by the same amount, by one stop. So if I go to 2.8, the ISO is now 3200. Great. So I have this indirect control of the ISO using the aperture. But let's say it's, 3200 is still too high and I'm okay with a slower shutter speed. Now if I want to go below 250, I don't go to the menu to, to change that minimum shutter speed. That's annoying. Instead, I just put it on manual, and now I have full control over the shutter speed and the aperture, but the ISO is still in auto. And if it's on 125th, which is half or double the one stop faster, or slower than the previous shutter speed of 250, you can see the ISO went down by one stop. It went from 3200 to 1600. And I can continue. If I go down to a 60th, now it's 800. If I go down to a 30th, now it's 400. So that's what I do. And usually, just on a side note, I keep it on a 50th all the time, so that when I go from AV to M, it's already on a 50th. So basically, I'm either shooting with my fast shutter speeds on AV or my slow shutter speeds on M. Of course, if I need a very fast shutter speed, like 500 or something sometimes, I'll also use M for that too. But that's kind of rare. Usually I'm going slower than faster. So I think of these as my fast mode, that's AV, and my slow mode, that's M. And auto ISO is always available. Of course, within either of those, if I need to change the exposure, I use the exposure compensation, which on M, when you're on M, it becomes this dial here, okay? Because this thing up here controls the shutter speed, but on AV, okay, this dial does nothing, and then this controls the exposure compensation, which indirectly controls the ISO and the shutter speed as well. So that brings me to focus modes and how do I focus. So I'll start with manual focus because that's the one I use the least. So as I mentioned, I map it to this button here, and then that allows me to then pressing the macro button here, and that allows me to focus with this dial like this. But frankly, I almost never use that, so no need to go into that anymore. The second most commonly used mode for me is actually snap focus. And I rarely use the full press snap. Instead, I turn snap focus on by pressing the FN button, which I already explained. I map focus there. And then I can just, shoot to my heart's content, knowing that the distance I've set is, somewhere out there. Now I keep it on 3.5 meters. They added that distance in a recent firmware update. And I think that's great. I actually think 5 meters was a little too far for this lens. 2.5 meters was quite close. I think 3.5 is a sweet spot, so I'm very glad they added it. And so I use that sometimes. As I said, I turn it on and off with FN, and then I do set the distance using the ISO button because I remapped it, but I generally keep it on 3.5. I do change it once in a while. And yeah, but the most common focus mode that I use is the, what is it called? Pinpoint AF. So if you go to the focus modes, there is Select AF, etc., 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 and I use Pinpoint AF, which gives you this tiny little square spot in the middle, like that. And of course, I can move it around with the touch screen, but I almost never do that. I find it just easier just to focus and then recompose as necessary. Because the depth of field on this 18mm lens is so deep that focusing and recomposing at most distances generally does not affect the focal plane. It will affect things if you're very close to a subject, in which case I would actually move the point around using the wonderful touchscreen. Which honestly, when I got the camera, I thought, it doesn't need a touchscreen. But then I kind of got used to it and actually think it's a useful thing to have. One more thing about focus recompose and shooting in general is, you know, I don't have to focus every time, because if I focus and I take a photo, then I can just take another photo with the same focus again and again if I keep this half pressed between photos, which means that the little square stays green even if I'm taking a photo. So let's see there, 1, 1 or 1, 2. Let's see if I get somebody else. Just to quickly demonstrate, it's like I focus on those people, and as they walk through, I'm taking another photo and another photo, and they're all in the same focus because I focused once and it stayed there. All right, no more examples, you get it. So those are the focus modes. I use MF a little bit of the time, snap focus occasionally, and most of the time I use autofocus with the Pinpoint AF and pre-focus and holding it down, okay? Those are my favorite modes for street photography. Okay, so that's like basically 95% of everything that matters for doing street photography with the GR for me. There are a couple more little things that I want to talk about. Number one, I shoot in RAW only. So that means I don't have to worry about like the film simulation or the picture style or the white balance or any of that stuff. And I like it that way. I want to be able to focus as much on the composition, the timing, and the moment, rather than on fiddling with the camera. When I first started photography years ago, I would mess with the white balance and change picture styles and whatever. And I just found that it made me be in the camera too much. So I stopped doing that, and I just try to defer all of those decisions to later. To me, to kind of get on a side tangent here, photography is just like, you're just making decisions. You're constantly deciding, are you going to frame it like this or like that? Are you going to use this setting or that? And the fewer of those decisions you have to do in a given moment, the faster you're able to react and, you know, and compose things. And so I don't want to complicate things by adding this layer of decisions. So therefore I shoot RAW and just decide all that stuff later while I'm at home in my comfy chair listening to music or a podcast and taking my time editing, where there's no urgency anymore. Okay, so that's very, very important. RAW and nothing else. So guys, that's it. That sums it up. That's how I set my Ricoh GR for street photography. And just to kind of reiterate, the most important thing is that I'm ever really changing, because once this is all set up, I almost never touch any of these settings. The only thing I'm doing is changing between AV and M if I want to go fast or slow. And when I'm on M, I change the shutter speed and the aperture. And when I'm on AV, I'm only changing the aperture. And of course, the exposure compensation if I think the camera's meter is too bright or too dark. That goes without saying. That's true for every single camera out there. All right, so I hope you guys found that summary of my favorite street photography or most important street photography settings useful. If you can use some of these ideas in your shooting, great. If you think I'm just doing it all wrong and you want to do it another way, great. I don't think that this is the only way to do it. It just happens to be the way that I do it. All right, so thank you guys so much for watching. Please don't forget to support us on Patreon to help us out to make more videos. Like I said, this video was requested by a Patreon supporter, and we right away, as fast as possible, shot it, although it's probably getting released weeks later because it takes time to edit. And also, of course, please like the video and leave any comments you'd like below, any requests or ideas, or tell me how you set your camera. I'd love to hear if you use some of the same settings or something totally different. All right, anyway guys, thanks for watching, and remember always, challenge your eye.